Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, I know you an email. Yeah. I thought about that. Yeah. Still thinking I'm over here.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's 1 o'clock, and this is our new time, so please, I hope you can get used to it. And this is done per request of a lot of colleagues from the West Coast who were not able to join us at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm Tanja Popović, Director of the Grand Rounds, and I'm really delighted to see so many of you still in person. I would also like to welcome those who are watching us on IPTV or via internet, and you will see that the Grand Rounds are always prominently displayed on our director's webpage, and this one shot has been clipped from this morning, so we're always on his webpage. Also would like to welcome many more people who are watching us live through our internet. As you do know, this is a continuing education eligible event, and so if you go to the web page below, you can register and then again check the month, the date, and following the completion of the event, you can sign up and submit for your credit. And we actually have been told by the office who does training and continuing education that they are getting a lot more requests for continuing education that is associated with our events as well. The other thing that I do want to point out is we are coordinating these events with our weekly issues of Science Clips, so you will see that this month we have a number of malaria-focused manuscripts featured in our Science Clips. One of the things that I do want to point out is that we have continued to have a large number of external viewers, and in some cases, actually, we had the numbers go through the roof, as was our chlamydia session this past June. This still holds the biggest number of viewers, almost 25,000 external viewers that day. As you may know, we are now on YouTube, and there is a lot of interesting things going on these days on YouTube, but I don't want to talk about being radiographed and checked when I go through the Atlanta airport. That would probably get a lot more viewers than this, but still you will see that each one of our sessions has gotten more than 1,000 people watching us on YouTube as well. And finally, when you combine everything, videos, live, downloads, over 168,000 views, attendances, or however you want to call them, have in a way participated and watched our Grand Rounds. And I really feel good about this, and our speakers appreciate this level of exposure. So today, we are going to be talking about malaria eradication, and we have really an outstanding group of experts and speakers here. Larry Slutzker, who is going to be talking about challenges in the past, challenges today, and those that are awaiting us in the future if we want to eliminate and ultimately eradicate malaria. John MacArthur, who is going to talk about what is it that is necessary for the first steps towards elimination. Patrick Kutcher, who is going to talk about science and scientific evidence that CDC has provided to support and position the world for elimination of malaria. And then Richard Steketee, who is going to talk about malaria elimination from the partnership perspective. I do want to bring to your attention, and I know Judy Gann sitting here in the audience is delighted, that there will be an exhibition coming to CDC and is going to be with us for several months that is focused on malaria, called Malaria, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And I would like to share with you just a few photographs that are going to be part of that event that I think are extremely telling of the malaria story. But things are not entirely gloomy. And as you will hear from our speakers, and I hope from the discussion, there is some reason for optimism as well, and there are some tools at our disposition that people are using and can be used against this disease. And this is one of the examples, and you will certainly hear about bed nets over and over and over, and you will see from this little clip how important and precious those things are in the lives of people whose health they protect. These are the 4 musketeers that are going to talk about their own experiences in fight against malaria, and who I think will leave you feeling better about what it is that CDC and the global community can do to eliminate and eradicate this disease. And with that, I am going to ask that we put a very brief tape of Dr. Frieden, who has taped his comments, and then we will move on to our featured speakers.
Malaria will kill nearly 1 million people this year, and almost all of these deaths could be prevented with currently available, relatively inexpensive tools. To make progress in malaria prevention and control, we need to better apply and protect the tools we have today, and we need to develop new tools for tomorrow. We need to optimize indoor protection with bed nets, drive down mosquito populations with indoor residual spraying, and save lives through accurate diagnosis and effective treatment. We also need to protect against and develop new tools to combat resistance by both mosquitoes and malaria parasites. Development of new tools could enable further and more sustained progress. But the current challenge is to scale up and preserve these tools and persevere with good management for as long as is needed to save lives, either until malaria is under long-term control or new tools become available to enable elimination and, ultimately, eradication. I'm sure that you'll find today's Public Health Grand Rounds on malaria thought-provoking, interesting, and important. Thank you.
If I believe my introduction. Thank you. I've got the honor of introducing the topic today and sort of setting the scene. I'm going to start off by briefly reviewing malaria basics, and then we'll review the first push for malaria eradication. I'll then touch on how malaria control worsened in the 1990s, and conclude with an introduction to promising developments over the past decade that have reawakened interest in malaria eradication. So although malaria has been recognized for centuries as a distinct disease entity, the cause was often attributed to environmental sources, such as exposure to miasmas or bad airs. It was only a little over 100 years ago that this trio of scientists with very admirable facial hair elucidated the biology, including the presence of parasites in the blood, transmission by Anopheles mosquitoes, and the complete mosquito-man-mosquito life cycle. Malaria is caused by an intraerythrocytic protozoan parasite of the genus Plasmodium. Human malaria is caused by 4 major species: Falciparum, Vivax, Ovale, and Malariae. Falciparum exacts the greatest toll in terms of mortality, though about 3 billion people are at risk of both Falciparum and Vivax. Falciparum malaria, if untreated, may be fatal in up to 10 to 20% of cases in non-immune persons, through either fatal severe anemia or because of seizures and coma, so-called cerebral malaria. Falciparum is also the species in which resistance to multiple antimalarials has appeared over the past 50 years. Worldwide, about 50 anopheline species are competent malaria vectors. Each has distinct behavioral and ecological niches. Breeding sites can include salt or fresh water and may be small, temporary, or larger permanent bodies of water. The major African vectors classically bite indoors and at night, but other species may bite or rest outdoors. These characteristics affect vector transmission efficiency as well as susceptibility to various control measures, such as spraying houses or using insecticide-treated bed nets. Falciparum malaria is one of the leading global child killers. In 2008, it caused an estimated 250 million clinical cases, with over 80% occurring in Africa, mostly in children under 5. In pregnancy, placental infection increases the risk of low birth weight and subsequent infant mortality. Of the estimated 800,000 plus deaths each year, more than 90% occur in Africa, and the burden also includes disability following severe disease and economic losses that are estimated at over 1% of GDP annually in sub-Saharan Africa. Here we see the spatial distribution and intensity of P. falciparum malaria. The darker areas in Central and Western Africa correspond to the most intense transmission, where the average prevalence of infection is more than 40% in children under 10. In some of these areas, residents may receive more than one infectious bite every day of the year. There were a number of events that influenced the decision to launch the malaria eradication campaign. There were early successes in mosquito control, including impressive reductions in malaria in the Panama Canal Zone. New highly effective interventions, chloroquine and DDT, became available at the end of World War II. An accurate diagnosis was available with relatively simple and cheap microscopy. With these tools, confidence swelled and enthusiasm for eradication grew. In 1955, WHO launched the Global Eradication Campaign. The key strategy relied on using the magic bullet DDT to reduce and hopefully interrupt transmission. The underlying assumptions were that people stay indoors at night and Anopheles enter to feed on sleeping persons, then rest on the walls after the blood meal, where they receive a toxic dose of DDT. Other major activities included anti-malarial drug treatment for patients, or occasionally as mass drug administration to rapidly reduce infectious burden. Surveillance was conducted for clinical cases and through mass blood surveys to detect asymptomatically infected persons. Though we know the eradication, of course, failed overall, there were some successes. 37 of the 143 countries that were endemic in 1950 were freed from malaria by 1978. In many countries, major gains were made in decreasing the burdens of disease and death. In the U.S., malaria control was established in the early 1940s through the Malaria Control in War Areas program, which subsequently became CDC. In 1951, malaria was considered as eliminated in the U.S. Overall, though, of course, the campaign had serious problems. These range from technical setbacks, such as development of resistance in mosquitoes to DDT and parasites to chloroquine, to strategic issues, with a rigid, inflexible program that resulted in slow responses to problems and a lack of research to find solutions. Africa was left out, meaning there was never real hope for global eradication. And from the sociocultural perspective, the military-style campaign did not build community buy-in, leading to decreasing cooperation with the malaria program, including allowing access to homes for spraying. In 1969, the World Health Assembly acknowledged the failure of the campaign and suspended it indefinitely. The goal shifted to control to minimize the health damage by malaria. Though less ambitious, the new strategy was more flexible as it emphasized control adapted to local conditions. There was a programmatic shift away from DDT and a reliance on treatment as the major intervention integrated into the primary health care package. In the late 80s and early 90s, the malaria situation in sub-Saharan Africa gradually worsened. Decreased funding led to poor access to treatment and consequent increased transmission. Parasite resistance to chloroquine emerged in Southeast Asia in the late 1950s and spread across South Asia and into Africa by the late 1970s. Despite worsening resistance with treatment failure rates exceeding 50% in East Africa in the early 1990s, chloroquine remained the mainstay of therapy, resulting in hundreds of thousands of excess child deaths. During this period, approximately 30% of childhood deaths in sub-Saharan Africa were attributed to malaria. Against this somewhat grim background, new developments at the turn of the millennium give rise to optimism. New global partnerships to coordinate work were established, and unprecedented funding for program scale-up became available. Endemic country leaders prioritized and committed to malaria control. Critically, better tools became available, including new drugs for treatment and insecticide-treated nets for prevention. I'd like to now turn to John MacArthur, who will tell the next part of the story.
Thank you, Larry. My name is John MacArthur, and I'm the Chief of the Program Implementation Unit at CDC's Malaria Branch. Today, I will provide an overview of the key global frameworks used in malaria control. I will introduce the Rollback Malaria Partnership and the Millennium Development Goals and how the President's Malaria Initiative has supported these frameworks under 2 presidents. Finally, I will present some results that malaria control programs have achieved in African countries. The Rollback Malaria Partnership was launched in 1998 by WHO, UNICEF, UNDP, and the World Bank in an effort to provide coordinated response to malaria. The partnership is a global framework that aims to coordinate activities, mobilize resources, and forge consensus among partners through the establishment of technical working groups and sub-regional networks. To assist in building consensus, RBM developed the Global Malaria Action Plan in 2008 to reduce malaria morbidity and mortality by scaling up proven interventions for impact and sustaining them over time. The UN Millennium Development Goals aim to reduce poverty through the establishment of time-bound targets with a deadline of 2015. Adequate control of malaria is imperative if countries are to reach these goals. It is directly related to 3 of 8 of the MDGs. Given that the groups at highest risk of dying from malaria are children and pregnant women, significant reductions in malaria will reduce child mortality, MDG 4, and improve maternal health, MDG 5. Lastly, MDG 6 is directly related to malaria control and serves to drive the national programs towards ensuring that every child sleeps under a bed net and has access to appropriate antimalarial medicines. With the onset of RBM and the MDGs, international financial disbursements to malaria endemic countries have increased from approximately $100 million in 2003 to nearly $1.5 billion in 2009. This includes large increases by the Global Fund, the President's Malaria Initiative, and the World Bank. In 2005, President Bush announced the launching of the President's Malaria Initiative. PMI was an ambitious plan to rapidly scale up malaria control interventions in high-burden countries. The President pledged $1.2 billion over 5 years and challenged other donor nations to increase their funding. PMI is led by USAID and co-implemented with CDC. The goal of PMI was, by the end of 2011, to reduce malaria-related mortality by 50% in 15 selected high-burden countries. This would be accomplished by scaling up coverage of key interventions targeting approximately 270 million people living in endemic regions of Africa. The 4 key interventions of PMI are rapid diagnosis and prompt treatment with artemisinin combination therapy, prevention using long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets, the use of indoor residual spraying in places where appropriate, and protecting pregnant women and their unborn children using intermittent preventive treatment. PMI began in 2006 with $30 million invested in 3 countries. The U.S. government rapidly scaled up resources, which allowed expansion into an additional 4 countries in 2007, and reaching the targeted 15 countries in 2008. With the funding available during the current year, the pledged amount of $1.2 billion was reached. During the presidential campaign of 2008, Barack Obama signaled his support for ongoing U.S. government efforts in global health, including malaria. After his election, the President launched a bold new approach. The Global Health Initiative is a framework that the U.S. now uses to invest up to $63 billion over 6 years to improve health outcomes. PMI is a major component of the Global Health Initiative. The 2008 Lantos-Hyde Act authorized up to $5 billion for malaria prevention and control through fiscal year 2013. Congress instructed CDC to advise the U.S. Malaria Coordinator and to be a key implementer of monitoring and evaluation, surveillance, and operations research. CDC is currently fulfilling that mandate through close communications with the Malaria Coordinator and providing technical inputs to national malaria control programs through field and Atlanta-based staff. This map highlights the original 15 PMI countries that were slated for investments. If you remember from Larry's presentation, these represent countries in Africa with some of the highest burden of disease. With the additional funding made available through the Lantos-Hyde Act, PMI has expanded to 2 major African countries, Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which account for 23% of the world's burden of deadly falciparum malaria. Here are some specific outcomes. Well, they cannot be completely attributed to PMI support, as they are the result of cumulative efforts from the national governments and other donors. Since routine surveillance systems are often weak, these data are collected through national-level household surveys done every 2 to 3 years, so that we have 2 data points to compare. The light blue bars represent ITN coverage pre-PMI, and the dark blue bars are data collected after PMI began investing in countries. What we see here is a significant increase in the proportion of households with at least one BedNet. While BedNet coverage is important, it is even more important that risk groups utilize the intervention. These data show the proportion of children under 5 years of age that actually slept under a BedNet the night before the survey. The PMI target for this indicator is 85%. While all countries have made progress, none have yet reached the target. In Zanzibar, PMI supports the National Malaria Control Program's efforts to scale up interventions. The left-sided y-axis is the percentage coverage of key interventions, and the right-sided y-axis is the proportion of patients in facilities with laboratory-confirmed malaria. As the coverage of BedNets, indoor residual spraying, and access to malaria medicines increased, the malaria positivity rate decreased from over 40% to 0.5%. These data show the reduction in all-cause under 5 child mortality in PMI countries. These data echo what we previously saw in Zanzibar, but across a larger subset of PMI countries. With increases in coverage of key interventions, we are seeing reductions in all-cause childhood mortality. While impressive strides are being realized with a massive scale-up of malaria control interventions, resistance is a lurking threat. PMI teams are beginning to report the emergence of resistance to insecticides used by national programs. Additionally, there are early signs that resistance is developing to the artemisinids, a key drug class in the combination therapy. This is occurring in the historical birthplace of the most antimalarial drug resistance, the Thai-Cambodian border. Widespread resistance to either intervention would likely slow and even reverse the reductions seen in mortality. In summary, in all 7 PMI countries with paired nationwide household surveys, we see substantial reductions in all-cause mortality in children under 5 years of age, ranging from 19 to 36%. While a variety of factors may be influencing the decline in under 5 mortality rates, there is strong and growing evidence that malaria prevention and treatment efforts are playing a major role in these reductions. These reductions followed massive scale-up of proven interventions. A thorough impact assessment is underway for the 15 PMI countries. I'm now going to hand over the lectern to Dr. Patrick Katcher, who will speak on the scientific evidence base of malaria control and the possibility for elimination.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. I'll review the science base for current malaria interventions this afternoon, talk briefly about the global malaria eradication research agenda, and finally describe how CDC's current operations research priorities address the unfinished work of scaling up interventions, as well as the promise of malaria elimination. CDC science contributed to defining the effectiveness of each one of the 4 key interventions that John described. I'm going to take a moment to demonstrate this in more detail with reference to insecticide-treated nets. Here are data from the impact of ITNs on child deaths from a Cochrane review that conducted a meta-analysis of all 4 published trials. CDC and the Kenya Medical Research Institute completed the final and most comprehensive trial, and the only one conducted in an area of intense year-round transmission. The collective results demonstrated a protective efficacy of 17% on child mortality, and that the intervention could save 5.5 lives for every 1,000 children protected, or a total of 250,000 children each year. Beyond contributing efficacy data, though, the studies conducted by CDC and KEMRI had important policy implications in other ways. They showed that people without nets experienced the same benefits in terms of reduced malaria infection, illness, anemia, and improved child survival, as long as they lived within 300 meters of a household that used nets. They showed that children protected by bed nets for up to 6 years experienced a survival benefit that lasted beyond early childhood. The infant and child mortality rates were as low after the follow-on period as they had been during the initial 2-year study. And finally, they showed the data that high coverage with nets, including covering school-aged children and adults, could ensure protection even for those who did not have nets. Together, these findings led to policies that supported widespread scale-up of insecticide-treated nets in all transmission settings and for promoting universal coverage. Before I talk about global research priorities for elimination, I'd like to acknowledge the observation that continued progress towards scale-up and ultimately elimination will require improved tools for malaria control and surveillance. It also requires a slightly different emphasis. While scale-up aims to minimize morbidity and mortality from the disease, elimination focuses on reducing transmission as measured by the basic reproduction number. As long as each human infection results in transmission to no more than one additional person, elimination is possible, although the prospect may be long range. For the past 18 months, more than 200 scientists from around the world have been working to define research gaps needed for malaria elimination. Their recommendations under the Malaria Eradication Research Agenda consider all aspects of malaria, including basic science and program. In addition to new drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, and insecticides, the effort will require health systems that can adapt to accommodate them. It will require strategies to manage the twin threats of antimalarial drug resistance and insecticide resistance. In this effort, combination treatments have become the mainstay, but combined delivery systems and rotational or mosaic deployment of insecticides or malaria drugs hasn't yet been explored. As Larry noted, our best vector interventions, house spraying and nets, are primarily effective indoors. But in many places, malaria vectors feed outside, and interventions like larviciding, spatial repellents, and baited traps offer hope for combating that. New approaches for using treatment drugs are also important, such as active screening and treatment, and the use of transmission-reducing drugs and vaccines. And finally, better surveillance methods are needed for measuring malaria transmission, both for detecting and responding to the outbreaks that will inevitably occur along the way toward elimination. I'll spend the rest of my time talking about CDC's current operational research priorities, which encompass both the unfinished work of scale-up of current interventions and the promise of elimination. These address three broad issues. First, to optimize the delivery of the currently recommended interventions. Second, to establish roles for new and revisited interventions through research and development, as well as clinical and field trials. And third, to integrate malaria control with other health and development initiatives. One promising R&D effort centers around malaria diagnostics. While light microscopy and antigen detection can reliably identify parasites, most people treated for malaria around the world don't benefit from them. Only recently has the World Health Organization called for universal access to malaria diagnosis and treatment for every case. Diagnostic confirmation could help minimize the overuse of malaria drugs, improve detection and treatment of other illnesses, and form the basis of a reliable system for monitoring malaria and its control. As endemic countries approach the elimination threshold, accurate and highly sensitive tests will become more critical. While the current diagnostic formats will improve management of illness, elimination may finally rest on molecular assays that have only been practical in reference laboratories far from the remote areas where transmission is likely to persist the longest. Researchers at CDC and the University of Georgia are developing a novel system for molecular diagnosis of malaria that could overcome this limitation. The technique, called RealLamp for short, makes it possible to detect parasites at very low numbers and without access to reference laboratory staff and equipment. They've already validated their first-generation prototype on specimens from Tanzania. We're also involved in several clinical and field trials. In Kenya, we collaborate on the first phase 3 trial of a malaria vaccine in African children. Development of this vaccine is supported by the Malaria Vaccine Initiative at 11 sites in 9 African countries. In earlier studies, it prevented 35% of clinical illness and 49% of severe malaria for up to 6 months. The vaccine candidate currently under trial could be deployed as soon as 2 or 3 years from now. While it will be important in reducing morbidity and mortality, this candidate vaccine won't have a direct effect on malaria transmission. There are dozens of other vaccines and hundreds of candidate antigens in various stages of development, and some of those might ultimately have an impact on transmission. The development of a malaria vaccine has been particularly elusive, partly because of the complex way the parasite and human systems have co-evolved. Some of our other field activities include field trials of insecticide-treated nets in combination with other vector control interventions, including indoor residual house spraying and in combination with durable insecticide-treated wall liners. And our third operations research focus is to explore integration opportunities. This is in keeping with the Global Health Initiative agenda, and examples of our current work include community-based delivery of malaria prevention, such as nets, alongside community-based child health campaigns and campaigns for eliminating neglected tropical diseases. It includes integrated management of febrile illness, which we support through intervention studies and systematic reviews, exploring integrated vector control programs, as well as integrated opportunities to monitor and evaluate our programs. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss CDC's past, present, and future role in elaborating the science of malaria control and hopefully elimination. Next steps will require intensive partnerships, and shown here on this slide are the logos of some of the global and domestic partners with which we currently work. I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Rick Steketee, who represents one of these partners, the Malaria Control and Evaluation Partnership in Africa.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and it's a pleasure to be here and to see a lot of familiar faces. I have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about malaria elimination and CDC's role and provide an external perspective, but as many of you realize, I learned my malaria here in this agency, so it runs the risk of being a recycled internal perspective. But luckily, I still have my beard, and while it's a little gray, it does qualify as facial hair. Let me point out first that there's a 500-page book that tells us what to do and how to do it. This dates back from the Global Malaria Eradication Program, was written by Dr. Pampana, who at that point led the WHO effort for malaria eradication. We have this session 2 weeks after The Lancet published a series of 4 articles on malaria elimination and several commentaries about this as well. So maybe malaria elimination is actually being recycled as we speak. The progress that John and Patrick just spoke to you about led people to say that now is the time to act. We should not ignore the shrinking of the malaria map, which has been successfully unfolding over the past century. So today I'll talk a little bit about the opportunity for elimination success and why today. I'll give you a brief African country example where they're trying to move forward and elimination is potentially in their sights. A partnership perspective in transitioning from scale up to elimination, and some opportunities where CDC can make a difference. First, let me let me begin with this graphic. This, or some form of this, has been shown with the Global Malaria Action Plan and the Rollback Malaria Partnership, and suggests that there are steps along the path from what I'll call pre-scale up onto elimination. When this is described, it's often suggested that each step along the way requires some reconfiguring and doing work in slightly different ways. I offer this instead, and that is that if we think that we have to take side steps and change the way we do things, then we maybe haven't thought out the path to elimination. And the real opportunity here, and the beauty of considering elimination, and the reason why we can do this today, is that the recent progress has allowed us the opportunity to see that path and perhaps figure it out and then take it. So, a little bit backwards, why today? Well, first of all, with the Global Malaria Eradication Program, and between that and the start of the Rollback Malaria Partnership, it was really a time of science. And this has just been described, but to summarize that, the scientists basically identified prevention directed to the biology of the vector and able to be delivered proactively into the most vulnerable people. And until we got to that point, we didn't really have a prevention intervention. The scientists also identified new treatment with combined drugs to optimize efficacy and delay resistance. Gave us huge hope. And diagnostics that can be deployed close to home and in facilities and can clarify where malaria transmission, illness, and death is occurring. That set of triad, the prevention, the treatment, and the diagnosis, takes us a long way. And while scientists are still seeking new and improved prevention, diagnosis, and treatment, and new interventions, we already have the final intervention. And I'll call that out as surveillance for infection detection and transmission containment. And I'll come back to this. So let me move briefly to an African country example for Zambia, a place I've had the pleasure of working over the last 5 years with the National Malaria Control Program. Zambia is located in the center of southern Africa. There's plenty of water there, as seen by the photo in the upper right. And that transmission map for 2006 in the lower right shows dark areas where there's more intense transmission and the somewhat lighter areas with a little bit less. But let me suggest that in 2006, malaria was holo-endemic across the nation. Well, this is showing the malaria intervention scale up over the last decade. And the use of the ownership and use of insecticide-treated nets by various groups, prevention and pregnancy, are all shown to be dramatically increasing, particularly from 2005 to 2010. And that red line is the line indicating those households with either ownership of an ITN or use of indoor residual spraying, and that's getting quite close to their 80% target. But what does that translate to? So let me move to Southern Province and Kazangula District in Zambia. And in 2005, they reported 981 cases in their surveillance system at facilities per 1,000 population. Essentially, everyone was getting malaria that year. They scaled up insecticide-treated nets and indoor residual spraying, and in subsequent years, they dramatically reduced the number of cases of malaria. 2008 and 2009, stable at 20 cases per 1,000 population. They also increased rapid diagnostic tests and introduced them back in 2005, 2006. So on the one hand, this set of 981 cases of malaria in 2005 was really reported fever, and now they're reporting malaria. On the other hand, with 6,850 rapid diagnostic tests used in 2008, only 21 showed up with malaria. So they've had huge progress, and the diagnostic tests have allowed them to actually know what they have. Well, that was one district, and these are the remaining 9 districts in southern province, with Kazangula district shown as this red line. I showed you the best case example, but there are now many districts in the province that have achieved rapid reduction in their malaria and are looking forward to what to do next. Let me move back to the partnership perspective. Elimination is on some, but not all of their agendas. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2007 took a quite bold step and put malaria elimination in the center of their agenda. The Rollback Malaria Partnership and the Rollback Malaria Strategic Plan actually has embraced elimination in the midst of this. What about CDC? Should CDC take a position on malaria elimination? Maybe, maybe not. But let me suggest that you consider embracing elimination. And not because you can eliminate malaria soon and everywhere, but because charting the path to elimination is actually charting the important way forward, and CDC can bring a huge number of strengths to that. So, some commentary again from the outside on CDC engagement. First, to focus on Africa, but work elsewhere, because there's still plenty of malaria elsewhere. And you already do this. The second is work with many partners. Patrick just showed you a slide with the many partnerships that you already have, so you already do this, particularly with the US President's Malaria Initiative and WHO and others. What do you do with your own resources, your people and your money, and your focus? First, I'll suggest that you continue to do control, as you do with the President's Malaria Initiative. But importantly, I'm suggesting that you consider the science of elimination on CDC's dime. Do this more explicitly and bring your strengths. Unfortunately, it will be more than a dime. The other issue is on capacity building. And I think for a moment about the work that CDC has done with state health departments across this nation and has really trained the cadre of public health professionals doing work in almost every state health department. So there's a huge amount of strength to bring to this. Let me return to surveillance in the midst of the discussion of the science of elimination. Surveillance, described in various papers within CDC, is about the consistent collection, analysis, and interpretation of data used for planning, implementing, and evaluating public health programs. That's a fairly broad definition. In Pampana's book, he describes surveillance as epidemiologic and remedial action to detect cases, register them, treat them, follow up with an investigation for the source and possible ongoing transmission, discover that transmission, establish its cause, eliminate residual foci, and end transmission and avoid its resumption, and to substantiate that elimination has been achieved. That's different. I'll suggest to you that that's an intervention in and of itself. And so CDC has the opportunity to take that surveillance as an intervention specifically to reduce transmission, to use the diagnostics and the anti-malarial drugs and pair them with investigational procedures and to test that intervention against its responsibility for containing transmission. The second issue was about capacity building. Capacity development for information management is perhaps a huge strength of this agency. And you can build on surveillance and transmission reduction in the midst of that. An example is to look at the Stop Polio model that was used. This was a partnership with CDC and Rotary International and with the World Health Organization. where people were able to volunteer and spend time overseas working on surveillance efforts, specifically to identify acute flaccid paralysis and immunize around it and contain transmission. So a stop malaria model is something that at least ought to be thought about. The second area is around the field epidemiology and laboratory training programs. You do a number of these in malaria endemic countries, and I would suggest that first you take a specific look and make sure that they're working on malaria if it's there in that country. And secondly, what more could they be doing? And it goes without saying that partnering for this work will be critical. The other thing that CDC brings is potentially a long view, and elimination and eradication will require nothing if not a long view. And so this CDC's ability to look at sustained public health focus amidst many competing priorities will actually be quite critical here. And believe me, there are plenty of competing priorities. So I'll begin to close by suggesting that you bring durable commitment. You provide leadership in the science of elimination. That will include the development of new tools and testing of new strategies, but in particular, you should consider building on your strengths in what you already know how to do, and that you train the next generation. You actively seek the strategic partnerships en route to this. But elimination and eradication is actually not for the faint of heart. This won't be easy, and it won't do well if you have 1 foot in and 1 foot out. The 1 foot out leaving you able to perhaps deny responsibility when things don't go so well. But staying out is a decision too, and that won't be very helpful for African children and their families. So consider committing. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rick, and I'd like to now open up the floor for any questions or comments. I'm instructed to ask you to be brief, that you get 1 question per customer, and that you identify yourself, and if you have facial hair, you get to go first. Anne?
Thank you. Great. Couldn't pass that up. Anne Shook at Immunization and Respiratory Diseases. That was terrific, all of you. You know, I love the line about not for the faint of heart and being in the midst of the polio eradication effort and considering measles elimination or eradication resolutions in the future. We're finding that you can learn a lot about elimination challenges in the places where it's the most difficult. And I wonder, Rick, in your Zambia slide, you had a lot of provinces going down, and you had 1 province in yellow that looked pretty flat. Is there a story behind what was happening there that would be something to learn from for the prospects?
Most definitely. First of all, we're actually going there looking to see how one issue is about their use of diagnostics, because you can imagine that some of the benefit that you saw on the slide was because of diagnostics use, so that if you didn't see any change across that time, it's probably indicative that diagnostics didn't actually reach that particular district. So that's being investigated. I'll point out, though, that you're absolutely right, and in a couple of other provinces in the country, they actually have had some challenges with resources, and they've had some delays in delivering their insecticide-treated nets to maintain their coverage, and they've actually seen resurgence. So this is not, and like I say, this is not for faint of heart, and every time we see a problem, we realize how much more aggressive and more proactive we need to be. And that's the name of this game, will be being proactive about it. This won't happen without that kind of work.
Dan Sossaman, Preparedness and Emergency Response. Struck by the statement Patrick made about benefit in areas that were not having the interventions directly, but were adjacent to them. And obviously one of the explanations is you're also doing more diagnostics and therefore categorizing more accurately. You don't want that to be the answer. Have studies been done of vector burden, infected vector burden, to establish that the bed nets themselves perhaps are reducing that burden, and then are baits and insecticides a solution for some of the external mosquito issues?
Thanks, Dan. Yes, a number of the studies, both of the extensive trials like the one in Western Kenya, did include documenting the impact on the vector population, and in fact, bed nets in a rural African context will reduce the total population of mosquitoes that are biting, either by having a direct effect on killing mosquitoes that happen to light on them, or simply by causing them to forage further for each meal, and you just have some mortality and attrition due to that extra time that they're spending and that extra effort. We do think our folks who are really keenly interested in the R&D and the transmission reduction aspect, the Gates Foundation in particular, are very keenly interested in exploring whether spatial repellents and baited traps will have an impact on outdoor biting mosquitoes that transmit.
Kevin DeCock, CGH. Thank you very much indeed. Excellent presentations. I wonder if I could ask Rick, I mean, how fragile is all of this? When we talk about elimination, the donors often talk about that with a view that at some stage in the future they're going to have to do less or put in less. And I get the impression with malaria that that's not necessarily the case. And allied to that, are any of the changes in the progress in Africa, could any of that be due to changes in climate, including the extensive drought that's happened in a lot of countries?
Yeah, there is no question. I think the idea that in the near term that this would actually be, you could start to save things by doing aggressive control, moving towards elimination, and stop doing something as you get there. I think that's actually fooling yourself. This will require more and more work. On the climate change issue, there's no question that the ups and, when you don't do any prevention, actually, and you don't contain transmission, malaria goes up and down with the climate. And with good prevention in place, we see huge benefit even against climate changes. Have we gotten benefit from a few dry years? Some people claimed some benefit in Ethiopia off of watching what happens after an outbreak, where they normally in Ethiopia come and go, and so with the climate change, Ethiopia gets a huge outbreak, and then in subsequent years they have much less malaria, and then they claim a lot of progress in those years. We run that risk, but I think actually the data would say at this point that it's really hugely built around high prevention coverage. Bed nets and indoor residual spraying really work in sub-Saharan Africa. And while it's the worst malaria in the world, it is those two interventions are so much better attuned to that mosquito vector in that environment than they are elsewhere. So it's actually hugely focused and positive, and but it is fragile. And part of the reason, I'll just push on this for a second, part of the reason for pushing towards elimination is that the buffer between just good enough control and really substantial transmission reduction, so that transmission edges back and you've got the system in place to turn it around and stop it, you won't get the morbidity and mortality at that point, where you will if you've just got almost enough control but you lose it, in which case it'll come back overnight.
Dan Rutz, Center for Global Health. My question has to do with the problems of fatalism and complacency, which I assume are both issues in the areas that you're working in. The success, Rick, that you pointed to, which is really dramatic over a short period of time, is there any evidence that that kind of success is showing others the possibilities and can be used as a vehicle for gaining traction in areas where people may not think that this is even possible for them or in the cards for any of their children in terms of improving the record on the malaria?
I think you're absolutely right. This is catalytic when you can get it to happen. And, the world is full of people who are actually quite reasonable and quite aware of what's going on around them. And when they stop seeing their kids dying during the rainy season, they start telling their friends that they made a difference. We've watched, everybody's worried about, we give you an insecticide-treated net to use, will you use it? And the answer is it takes a little while, but we're seeing incredibly high rates of use now that we didn't see 2 years ago. And I think that's because people are actually, the word gets out, and the word community to community is just huge.
If I could just add, I think that it's a delicate balance between identifying successes and using that as a catalyst and avoiding irrational exuberance where elimination goals are declared in places that really haven't yet made much of a success in scaling up and reducing transmission, which has also happened. So there needs to be sober consideration of the situation and careful uses of the words elimination and eradication as the discussion goes forward.
Thank you. Mark Eberhard, Parasitic Diseases. In both sort of looking forward to this concept of eradication and a little bit about the details. So you've talked about getting your transmission level below R0, or where you're less parasites coming into the system. You've got good interventions, possibly new interventions. The coverage rates are going up. The incidence rates are coming down. But you still, at least from my experience in other programs, have to have some indicators that you measure to show you that you've interrupted transmission. So it's serial surveys in young kids showing that you're not having exposure, and you're looking at the vector to make sure that it's below a certain level, and you have a modeling system that it can account for various things. So in that regard, where are we at with malaria looking forward toward eradication in terms of what are the indicators going to be and what are the levels that you think you're going to have to be measuring or getting to actually then start withdrawing your interventions and marshaling your resources into other areas?
Thanks. It's a very good question and a very packed topic to discuss. But I think immediately the application of confirmed diagnosis and getting systems to work that report illness and confirmed illness due to malaria parasitemia will be important. That will take us very far with the scale up of the current set of interventions and with the first generation vaccine that we're likely to have available. But part of the next step will have to be better methods for measuring malaria transmission. And we can look at things like age distribution of serologic outcomes. That's a bulky measure. We can look at things such as ex vivo studies to examine whether or not someone has transmission blocking immunity. But that's incredibly cumbersome and difficult to actualize in any way. So the tools that we need are not just parasite diagnosis or vaccines or drugs, but they're also understanding transmission better and having a better way of measuring it so that we can mark progress.
I think we have time for one more question. I don't know if there are any from the virtual world. If not, anyone, one last question? Sure, go ahead.
I was just wondering, you mentioned about the vaccine and the fact that it reduces severity and mortality. But my question is, might there be some unintended consequences by introducing such a vaccine on other current efforts that are going on in preventing malaria?
Malaria immunology in nature is very complex, and it comes at the expense of quite a few lives lost in the process. So there is a lot of concern that malaria vaccines might also elicit a lot of the immune processes that are associated with severe illness from the disease. I think that has to be watched very carefully, and that's been a stumbling block for a number of malaria vaccines in early stages of development. We haven't got this far as we are with the current vaccine, the RTSS vaccine, before. So right now, I think one of the major outcomes for these large field trials in 11 sites in Africa is not only to look at the immunogenicity, but also the safety and the impact on other vaccines that are delivered to children alongside it.
Thank you all very much for attending in person or virtually. Also, please continue sending your feedback. We are receiving a lot of feedback, and we really needed to continue improving our events. We will see you in several weeks, same time, same place. And please, let's give one more round of applause for our presenters.